last week. I'm Osinachi Okafur, and we're here at the Museum of Fine Art Houston speaking with Dumas about the exhibition Gauguin in the World. Hi, Anne.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
I'd like to know, how do you feel about this epoch-making event being the first to explore Gauguin's inner journey to developing his identity?
Well, I think this is a wonderful exhibition. Gauguin's a fascinating artist who lived a very interesting life, and as you say, his inner identity really comes out. The exhibition covers his entire career from the very beginning to his very last years, or we're in the gallery now at the end of the exhibition. And we see this constant questing, the way he moves for different places, different countries, to kind of re-stimulate his art.
You have quite a large collection of his ceramics work. I'd like to know the origins and where he was making these works.
Yes, the ceramics are a very interesting part of the show, I think. It's very rare to see so many examples together. He started making those in Paris in 1886. First of all, he was taught a little bit by quite a well-known ceramicist in Paris, but then he really took off on his own and made these weird and wonderful shapes. He called them my monstrosities because they are very strange. But he's also looking at ancient Peruvian and Mexican ceramics. He had connections with South America. As a child, he'd lived in Peru for a few years. And so that really influenced these very highly unusual works in ceramic.
Now, I also see you have quite a large number of his prints.
Yes.
I see that the prints is like one of his important media. Could you tell me a bit about it?
Yes, I think one of the things we really tried to bring out in this exhibition is the range of different artistic media that Gauguin worked in. People tend to think of him as primarily a painter, which is true, but he's also, he's always exploring, always trying to find new means of expressing. And the prints, he did 3 major series of prints, and we have them all in the exhibition. In one gallery, you'll see a whole wall of prints all printed on bright yellow paper, which was very radical and unusual at the time. Why did he choose yellow paper? Quite soon before he made those prints, he'd been living and working with Vincent van Gogh in the south of France, when Van Gogh had been painting his sunflower paintings. So sometimes it's suggested that stayed in Gauguin's mind, and he chose to make these prints on yellow paper. And then there's a second series that we've shown on a yellow wall of woodcuts. He was very talented at wood carving, but he began making these wonderful prints using woodcut and then printing them in different colors. And they really repay looking very closely.
How does Gauguin explore syncretism and symbolism in his works?
Yes, well, when he was in Paris particularly, he was in Paris for two years between his 2 trips to Tahiti. So that's between 1891 and 1893. And he had a whole circle of friends. They used to have wild parties in his studio once, or at least once a week. And many of them were symbolist writers, like the famous French poet Stéphane Mallarmé, for example, writers who were not so much interested in description, but in suggestion and kind of conveying poetic ideas without trying to sort of pin them down. So Gauguin's very influenced by that kind of thinking. And really, once he gets to Tahiti, his paintings are no longer realistic. They might start out, he has a sketchbook and he draws motifs which are the starting point, but the end result is something partly imaginary and intended to be, poetic.
So how was the kinship between Gauguin and Edgar Degas? Do you think it bolstered his career in any way?
Yes, Gauguin started out as quite a conventional impressionist painter. At the time when he was in his 20s and living in Paris and working, strangely enough, as a stockbroker. And he was just a Sunday afternoon painter. But he did meet some of the early Impressionists, and so he sort of started to copy them. He had very little real training. But he had a particular admiration for Degas, which is kind of strange because their subjects are so different. You know, when we think of Degas, we immediately think him as the painter of ballet dancers, whereas Gauguin's subjects are about Brittany, about Tahiti, couldn't be more different. But what he really admired about Degas was the way he depicted the human figure. And in so many of Degas' dance subjects, they're not actually the dancers on the stage, though he does portray them. He's very interested in what goes on behind the scenes, the way the dancers sit or move when they're just tired or resting. And we see Gauguin picking up a lot on those poses in his paintings, even though the subjects are very different. And he's also very interested in the way that Degas positions his figures in space. And actually, Degas also admired Gauguin very much at a time when not many people did. And Degas was one of the first people to actually buy paintings by Gauguin. He bought 8 altogether, and we have 2 works in this exhibition that used to belong to Degas.
Did Van Gogh's sunflowers influence Gauguin? Because I don't know.
Yes, we're looking at a very fascinating painting here called Still Life with Hope. It's one of Gauguin's last, painted right at the end of his life when he was no longer in Tahiti but had moved to the Marquesas Islands. And you can see the painting of a young nude girl sitting on a white cloth. That is a reproduction of a painting by quite a well-known, sort of more academic painter called Puvis de Chavannes that Gauguin owned. He owned the reproduction. When he traveled to the South Seas, he took with him a suitcase full of photographs, reproductions of all the artists he admired. And then just below that, you see the figure with the nude moving off to the left. That is actually a monotype by Degas that Gauguin had with him when he was in the Marquesas Islands. And then it tells us a lot about his different interests because the flowers are in a piece of pottery from the Marquesan Islands, but the wonderful sunflowers that really dominate the composition, he's sort of paying homage to his former friend Van Gogh. Van Gogh was dead at this point. So it's an interesting painting because it shows all the different influences that feed into his art.
I'd like you to explain Atiti to me. I find the painting quite captivating.
Oh yes, that's a lovely little painting, Atiti. We just hung it on a wall by itself. It's probably the smallest painting in the exhibition, actually. I hadn't thought. You know, it's a tragic little painting, but painted with great affection by Gauguin, I think. It's a little boy who Gauguin knew because he was the son of his neighbors. When he first moved to Tahiti, he lived in the capital city, Papeete, and he lived in a traditional Tahitian house with a veranda in front of it. And the family next door was a French colonial officer of some kind, and his wife, who I believe was Tahitian. And they had this little boy called Atiti, who Gauguin used to play with on the veranda. And when he's when he's quite young, like 3 or 4 years old or something, he suddenly gets a really serious illness and dies. And so the parents ask Gauguin if they will paint a portrait of him on his deathbed. In accordance with sort of certain Catholic rites, he's dressed, they've dressed him, he's dressed in white, he has a sort of necklace around his neck, and he's just lying on the pillow. So Gauguin asked them to paint their son dead, kind of so they would have a memory of him. And I mean, it's a painting with an interesting story.
We see that he's really a motivated artist, and we have a lot of his self-portraits in this exhibition.
Yes.
Of what significance are these self-portraits?
The self-portraits are very significant. He's an artist that did a lot of self-portraits, sort of exploring his psyche and his inner self. The very first painting in the exhibition is his very first self-portrait, and that he painted when he was staying with his wife's family in Copenhagen, when he'd lost his job as a stockbroker, so they had to go and live with her family because he had no money. But he didn't get on with her family at all, and so that self-portrait is, he'd gone up to the attic in their house to get away from them, I think. And he shows himself in front of his canvas, so you can see the palette, and he's holding a brush, and he's looking out at us in a very determined way. And this is very significant because this is the moment when he really decided he would be an artist, and he never deviated from that ambition. And he writes back to friends in Paris at the time about that portrait, and he said, "There's only one thing I can do, paint," and he underlines that word 3 times. And then 2 of the other self-portraits in the show him identifying with the figure of Jesus Christ in different ways. And he does this in several of his self-portraits. We have 2 examples here, because he saw himself as a sort of person of suffering and rejected by mankind, as Christ was. So he kind of layers his self-portraits. He adds other meanings to them.
Could you tell me about the last one, the last self-portrait,
Yes, the last self-portrait is in this gallery here. It's the last work you see when you leave the exhibition, and it's very different from any self-portrait he'd painted before, because when he was younger, he often presents himself as a rather colourful, bohemian, bravura artist, or else in these other works, involved with Christ in different ways. But in the last self-portrait, it's as if he's completely bare. It's just head and shoulders. He's just wearing a simple white kind of tunic of some sort. He's wearing glasses, spectacles, and he just gazes out in a completely no sort of softening. It's a very stark image of himself. He was near death at this stage. I mean, he died. He was only 54 when he died, but he was very ill at the end of his life, and it has been compared. It's a rather interesting comparison. It looks like some of these very early ancient Roman funerary portraits, where you get, because it's quite a small painting, and the upper figure of Gauguin, his face, fills up almost the entire space of the canvas, and he just looks out with these sort of staring eyes, which is very much like these Roman funerary portraits, which he would have known from seeing in the Louvre in Paris.